In an age when empires rose and fell by the weight of gold, one name became synonymous with power itself. A name whispered in royal courts, stamped on treaties, and etched into the backbone of global finance. They were not kings, yet they lent to kings, not generals, yet their fortunes won wars.
From the narrow alleys of Frankfurt to the marble halls of London and Paris, their influence shaped the world we live in. A dynasty built not on conquest, but on calculation, faith, and vision.
This is not just the story of a family, it is the story of capitalism itself, of how one house of bankers rewrote the fate of nations and left a mark on history that still glimmers in the gold of the modern age.
The Rothschilds, the house that built modern power.
In the year 1875, a single deal changed the course of global history. Europe was charging into its age of empire, and Africa was about to be carved up like a map on a table. Britain already commanded vast lands, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh among them, yet even this empire had limits. A new French-built canal through the Sinai now joined the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, reshaping world trade. For Britain, the Suez Canal was more than an engineering marvel. It was the lifeline to India. No longer would ships endure the long, dangerous voyage around Africa. The canal meant speed, power, and control. But there was a problem. It wasn't theirs. London's leaders wanted a piece of it, and they needed immense capital to make that happen. That's when the Rothschild banking house in London stepped forward. They provided Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's government with a massive loan, £4 million, an astronomical sum at the time. With that money, Britain secured a major share in the Suez Canal Company. It was a calculated move that gave the empire its new artery to the east. Within 7 years, Britain tightened its grip on Egypt and claimed control of the canal. It wasn't just about ships and trade routes, it was about dominance. And behind that dominance stood the quiet power of the Rothschilds, a family whose financial reach stretched deep into the machinery of empire.
This marks the beginning of their legend, the Rothschilds, the family bankers of Europe. Their rise began in the late 18th century, but their roots ran far deeper, reaching back to the 16th century. They were Jewish, and like many of their faith, their ancestors had been driven out of Western kingdoms such as France and England centuries earlier. From exile and perseverance, a dynasty was born. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century tore through Europe with merciless force. In many towns, 1 in every 3 souls perished. Fear turned to blame, and Jewish communities across the continent became the scapegoats. Rumors spread that wells were being poisoned, leading to massacres and expulsions. Countless Jewish families fled eastward to Germany and Poland, searching for safety and a chance to rebuild.
Whether the Rothschilds were among these wandering families remains uncertain. Their name offers little clue. Rothschild comes from the German words Rothschild, meaning red shield. Some say their home or place of business bore such a sign, a mark that later became their family emblem. That red shield would one day hang over some of Europe's most powerful banks, but in the beginning, it was simply a name, a symbol of survival and trade.
By the late 17th century, the Rothschilds were already moneylenders in Western Germany, one of the few professions open to Jews at the time. Christian law forbade usury, the lending of money for interest, leaving that niche largely to Jewish financiers. Ironically, what had once been a forced occupation would later feed centuries of anti-Semitic myths about greed and control. But in truth, it was simply business, and it kept families like the Rothschilds alive.
By the 18th century, the family had settled in Frankfurt, where one man, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, would transform their modest trade into a dynasty. His rise didn't happen in isolation. It was tied to the birth of modern capitalism itself. Europe was changing fast, and money was becoming a new kind of power. Mayer understood that world better than most. To grasp his success, we have to step back. Capitalism as a system was still young, but the idea behind it, reinvesting profit to create more wealth, was ancient. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the markets of Greece and Rome, debt and trade had always defined civilization. By the late Middle Ages, Italian bankers were already issuing letters of credit sealed with wax to merchants traveling across cities. Out of these roots grew a revolution. In the 16th and 17th centuries, capitalism flourished in a small triangle between London, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, driven by the cloth trade. The first stock exchanges, or bourses, appeared in Bruges and Antwerp, soon spreading to London and Amsterdam. Merchants began pooling their wealth in joint stock ventures, sharing risk and reward. Then came the great corporations, the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company, born at the dawn of the 17th century. They changed everything. Trade became empire, and finance became the engine of the modern world. It was in this new landscape of credit, speculation, and global commerce that Mayer Amschel Rothschild would make his move and rewrite the story of wealth forever. By the dawn of the 18th century, the full machinery of capitalism was taking shape. Banks, stock exchanges, corporations, and the growing practice of speculative investment. Yet Europe did not transform into a capitalist world overnight. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, the continent still operated under the older doctrine of mercantilism, where nations saw wealth as a fixed pie, and every gain by one was a loss to another. Under this system, global trade was a battlefield. Nations like England, the Dutch Republic, and Portugal fought bitterly over the same prize. Spices from the East Indies, pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, luxuries that could make or break empires. Their ships clashed across the seas, each determined to dominate trade routes rather than share them. Cooperation was almost unthinkable. Conquest was the only language they knew. But by the mid-18th century, that mindset was beginning to shift. In 1776, a Scottish economist named Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. His ideas changed everything. He argued that prosperity didn't have to be stolen, it could be created. Wealth could expand through productivity, innovation, and open markets. Europe began to awaken to the truth that cooperation and expansion could bring far greater riches than endless war. Still, this new vision required one thing above all: capital. It needed financiers bold enough to risk money in the pursuit of growth. The Rothschilds were about to become those financiers, the quiet architects of an age when money could move nations. The story begins with Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the man who laid the foundation for the family's empire. He was born in Frankfurt on the 23rd of February, 1744. At the time, Frankfurt was a free imperial city, an independent state within the Holy Roman Empire, much like a miniature country. It was wealthy, well-connected, and home to one of Europe's great book fairs, a tradition that still survives today. Mayer's father was a modest but successful merchant. He traded in goods and occasionally lent money to local nobles. Though respected, the family lived simply, sharing cramped quarters with more than 24 relatives. It was a crowded but ambitious household, one that taught young Mayer both discipline and drive.
At just 13, he was sent north to Hanover to apprentice under Simon Wolf Oppenheimer, a fellow Jewish banker who managed finances for the Hanoverian government, the same dynasty that ruled England. For 6 years, Mayer absorbed everything he could about trade, lending, and negotiation. When he finally returned to Frankfurt in 1763, he was ready to take his place in the family business and quietly prepare for a future far greater than anyone could have imagined. Over the next 2 decades, Mayer Amschel Rothschild proved himself a master of finance. He built a reputation for reliability and precision, lending money to princes, dukes, and noble families across the German states. His success reached new heights in 1785, when William IX, the new Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, appointed him as his personal financial agent. William was one of the richest men in Europe, and his trust in Mayer gave the banker access to enormous wealth, a fortune that would soon shape the fate of nations.
Just 4 years later, in 1789, France erupted. Decades of debt and mismanagement drove King Louis XVI to call the Estates General, a meeting of France's social orders that hadn't convened in nearly 2 centuries. It was meant to calm the kingdom. Instead, it ignited revolution. The monarchy collapsed, the king and Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, and France descended into chaos. Across Europe, monarchs trembled. Austria, Prussia, and Britain soon joined forces to crush the revolution before it spread. The wars that followed the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars raged from 1792 to 1815. Hesse-Kassel, like many German states, was drawn into the conflict. As the custodian of William's immense fortune, Mayer Rothschild found opportunity amid turmoil. He loaned money to warring powers like Austria and Prussia at profitable rates, becoming a key financier behind their military efforts. In an age of collapsing governments and shifting alliances, his calm precision made him indispensable. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and swept across Europe, even his conquest of Germany could not stop the Rothschild network. Napoleon's continental system, a trade blockade meant to strangle Britain's economy, only created more shadow markets. Mayer quietly financed smuggling routes, moving goods and gold across borders despite the emperor's ban. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. By the time Napoleon fell, Mayer had transformed wartime chaos into staggering wealth. Under his leadership, the Frankfurt branch became the beating heart of the Rothschild empire. The family's influence grew so great that even the old walls of prejudice began to crack. In 1811, Frankfurt abolished its restrictions against Jews, granting them full civic rights. For Mayer, this was more than a legal victory. It was proof that wealth and reputation could challenge centuries of discrimination.
Yet Mayer's ambitions stretched beyond Germany. As Europe bled itself dry through endless wars, the British treasury found itself desperate for funds. Maintaining vast fleets, waging campaigns across Spain and Portugal, and supporting allies had drained even the world's richest empire. Traditional banks hesitated to lend, the Rothschilds did not. Their reach, capital, and speed made them invaluable.
Then came Napoleon's fateful gamble, the invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812. It was a turning point, not just in war, but in finance. As armies marched and empires trembled, the Rothschilds were ready, watching, waiting, and moving money faster than anyone else in Europe. Their rise from Frankfurt's narrow streets to the vaults of kings had only just begun. At first, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. By autumn, his grand army had reached Moscow, seizing the city in triumph. Yet, victory never came. The Russians refused to surrender, burning their own capital rather than yield. As winter closed in, the emperor's army began its desperate retreat through snow and starvation, shattered by cold, hunger, and endless pursuit. Europe watched as the myth of Napoleon's invincibility froze and died on the Russian plains. In that moment of chaos, Mayer Rothschild's sons made their decisive move. As new coalitions formed to crush France, the brothers extended massive loans to Britain and its allies, millions of pounds that would equal billions today. These funds kept armies marching, fleets sailing, and nations alive. And in return, the Rothschilds earned not only vast wealth, but the trust of kings. They also possessed something far rarer: information. Through their courier networks, they knew of victories and defeats before governments did, allowing them to buy and sell bonds at exactly the right time, profiting from what would today be called insider knowledge. By the time Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, Mayer himself was gone. He had died 3 years earlier, just as word reached Frankfurt that the French army was advancing on Moscow. Leadership passed to his 5 sons, trained, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to the family's vision. Unlike many heirs who squander their inheritance, the Rothschild brothers expanded it, building a network that would dominate European finance for generations. As the wars drew to a close, the 5 brothers divided their power like the points of a star. Amschel, the eldest, remained in Frankfurt to oversee the heart of the family enterprise. Salomon went to Vienna, Karl to Naples, Nathan to London, and the youngest, James, to Paris. These 5 arrows, as they came to be known, represented the reach of a single family, stretching across a continent united by blood, capital, and an almost supernatural sense of timing. Their first great fortune came from mastering the post-war bond market. As governments rebuilt after years of destruction, the Rothschilds bought national debts for pennies and sold them back for immense profit when stability returned. Through their branches in London and Paris, they became indispensable to Europe's recovery. Money flowed through their hands: war reparations, reconstruction loans, and the birth of new industries.
In Paris, the youngest brother, James Mayer Rothschild, arrived at only 20 years old. It was a bold move, a young man establishing a financial empire in a city that had only recently overthrown its emperor. Yet James thrived. While Britain and France had been enemies for decades, the Rothschilds financed both sides, understanding that stability, not loyalty, was the true foundation of wealth.
After Napoleon's fall, James aligned himself with the restored Bourbon monarchy, helping to rebuild France's shattered economy. In 1817, he founded Des Rothschild Frères, the Bank of the Rothschild brothers, which soon became the powerhouse of Western European finance. France was ready to industrialize, to rise from its revolutionary ashes, and James Rothschild would be there to fund that transformation, one investment, one empire, one generation at a time. France, humbled by its defeats, began to look outward again. Its leaders realized that Britain, a mere island nation, had managed to conquer Napoleon's vast empire, not through manpower, but through machines, steel, and ships. Industry and naval power had proven stronger than armies. Determined to catch up, France launched a wave of industrial expansion during the 1820s, particularly across the north in cities like Lille. And at the center of this transformation stood James Rothschild. His Paris bank supplied the lifeblood of progress capital. Mills, factories, and railways all rose on the foundation of Rothschild loans.
A few years later, in 1830, rebellion erupted in the southern Low Countries. The Flemish and Walloon peoples rose against Dutch rule, forging a new nation, Belgium. Once again, the Rothschilds were ready. The Paris branch became the principal financier of Belgium's first monarch, King Leopold I. By purchasing large portions of Belgian bonds and investing heavily in the young nation's industry, they cemented their influence for decades. Belgium soon became a continental hub of the Industrial Revolution, and the Rothschilds held its economic heartbeat firmly in their grasp.
Yet the most powerful branch of all was in London. Britain was no longer just an empire, it was the empire. The 18th century had already seen it conquer India and establish colonies in Australia. But the 19th century pushed it into global dominance. Singapore rose in 1819, Hong Kong followed in the 1840s, New Zealand was settled soon after, and the Cape Colony was seized from the Dutch. By the 1880s, Britain ruled a near-continuous stretch from Egypt to South Africa, an empire on which the sun truly never set. Behind that empire stood financiers like Nathan Rothschild. By 1804, he was already in London, managing vast funds and quietly fueling Britain's war machine against Napoleon. While his brothers bankrolled other nations, some even enemies, Nathan gambled everything on Britain's eventual victory. He bought government bonds, issued loans, and stabilized the treasury when others hesitated. Had Napoleon triumphed, it might have ruined the family. But Britain prevailed, and when it did, Rothschild wealth multiplied overnight. Nathan's greatest triumph came at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, as British and Russian forces crushed Napoleon for the final time, Nathan's private courier network raced across Europe to deliver the news faster than any official messenger. Armed with that knowledge, he acted before the markets even realized the war was over. Within hours, the Rothschilds positioned themselves perfectly to profit from peace. It wasn't just luck, it was foresight, precision, and the mastery of information. And it was that moment, Waterloo, that transformed the Rothschilds from great bankers into financial legends. Nathan Rothschild received news of Waterloo faster than the British government itself. Armed with knowledge that Napoleon was finished, he made bold moves on the London Stock Exchange before the official reports arrived. When the market panicked, Nathan quietly bought government bonds at low prices, and when victory was confirmed, their value soared. The profits were immense, yet his speed and success sparked controversy. Whispers of fraud and manipulation followed the family for decades. Still, what Nathan had done was not magic. It was mastery of information in a world where timing meant everything. In the years that followed, Nathan expanded the British branch with relentless precision. He began purchasing vast quantities of gold at a time when the gold standard ruled global finance, every note, every credit line, backed by tangible metal. Controlling gold meant controlling liquidity, and Rothschild vaults became the beating heart of Britain's monetary system. By the mid-1820s, his fortune was so vast that he could lend directly to the British government itself, rescuing it during a financial crisis.
One of his most consequential acts came in 1833, when Britain finally abolished slavery across its empire. The government promised to compensate plantation owners in the Caribbean, a moral victory, but one requiring enormous sums. Nathan Rothschild's bank provided a key portion of that loan, enabling the payment that made emancipation possible. In a paradox of history, the wealth of one of Europe's richest men helped fund the freedom of hundreds of thousands.
By the time Nathan died, his family's holdings represented roughly 1 out of every £160 in the entire British economy. His sons carried the empire forward, and their influence deepened. It was the Rothschilds who later financed Britain's acquisition of the Suez Canal shares, securing control over the most vital waterway on Earth. They also bankrolled the railway boom of the 1830s and 40s, fueling Britain's transformation into an industrial giant. By the 1850s, the British government wasn't just borrowing from the Rothschilds, it was employing them. Their expertise was so respected that they advised the Royal Mint, shaping national monetary policy. Members of the family entered Parliament, and even the world of sport felt their presence. Rothschild horses became regular champions on the racing circuit, symbols of both wealth and prestige. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. The five brothers who had once spread from Frankfurt to Paris, Vienna, Naples, and London now sat among the aristocracy. In 1822, Emperor Francis I of Austria honored them with noble titles. Each brother was made a Freiherr, or baron, in recognition of their role in financing wars and rebuilding Europe. The irony was clear. These same bankers had once funded Napoleon, the very man Austria had fought to destroy.
The titles elevated them socially as much as financially. Later, Rothschilds received further honors. French branches earned the Legion of Honor, while others gained honorary Austrian citizenship. But Britain bestowed the most lasting prestige. In 1847, Anthony Rothschild was named a baronet, marking the family's formal entry into the English aristocracy. Then, in 1885, Nathan's descendant, Lionel Nathan de Rothschild, achieved what no Jew in Britain had before. He became the first Baron Rothschild. From the crowded alleys of Frankfurt to the halls of Parliament, the journey was complete. A family of bankers had become legends of empire. As the Rothschilds gained titles across Europe, their name began to evolve. Nobility came with linguistic flourishes in Germany. They became von Rothschild, in France, de Rothschild. These subtle changes marked their elevated status, signaling that the once persecuted Jewish moneylenders of Frankfurt had risen to stand among princes and barons. Their ascent was not just financial, it was social, cultural, and deeply symbolic.
Yet not every venture brought triumph. In 1821, with Europe stabilizing after decades of Napoleonic conflict, Karl Mayer Rothschild was dispatched to Italy to establish a new branch of the family bank. His destination was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, a vast realm stretching across southern Italy and the island of Sicily. At that time, the peninsula was a patchwork of states, each jockeying for power under the watchful eyes of France and Austria. The Rothschilds entered Naples with more than business in mind. Backed by Austrian interests, they sought to influence politics in the south, just as their brothers shaped finance in the north. For decades, Karl's bank became a tool of both commerce and diplomacy, extending loans to the Bourbon rulers who governed the kingdom. The monarchs, wary yet dependent, took the money they needed while keeping a cautious eye on their powerful creditors. But the tides of nationalism were rising. In 1859, the Second War of Italian Independence broke out, weakening Austrian influence across the peninsula. Then came Giuseppe Garibaldi's daring expedition of the Thousand, a small volunteer army that swept through Sicily and southern Italy in 1860, toppling the Bourbon regime in a campaign that seemed almost miraculous. When Italy finally unified under King Victor Emmanuel II, the Rothschilds' Austrian ties made them political outsiders. Their Neapolitan operations soon faded into history. The fall of the Naples branch was little more than a footnote in the family's story. Elsewhere, their influence only deepened. Across the Atlantic, the Rothschilds played a quiet role in shaping a new nation, Brazil. Once a colony of Portugal, its fate sealed by the 15th century Treaty of Tordesillas, Brazil's path to independence in the 19th century would once again intertwine with the financial power of Europe's most formidable banking dynasty.
promise of gold drew
For
men
centuries, Portugal barely glanced at the vast, forested expanse of Brazil. Then, in the 1690s, gold was discovered and everything changed. Waves of Europeans and enslaved Africans flooded the colony in search of fortune. By the early 19th century, Brazil had become the jewel of the Portuguese Empire. But in 1807, when Napoleon's armies invaded Portugal, the royal family fled across the Atlantic, ruling their empire in exile from Rio de Janeiro.
The New World would now serve.
Across Latin America, revolution was spreading. Spain's colonies, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, were breaking free one by one. Brazil, too, sought independence, but with diplomacy rather than bloodshed. In 1822, it declared itself a sovereign nation. The separation, however, left Brazil in financial ruin. Its new government faced debts, instability, and the looming threat of war with Portugal. That's when Nathan Rothschild intervened.
The Brazilian envoys waited.
Through his London bank, Nathan issued a massive loan to the Brazilian crown, a sum large enough to stabilize the nation's economy and pay Portugal compensation for the loss of its colony. The payment avoided conflict, secured diplomatic recognition, and placed Brazil on the path to peace. In return, the Rothschilds gained deep financial interests in the country, extending their reach into South America. It was one of many times they would quietly shape the birth of nations. As the 19th century advanced, Rothschild ventures multiplied. Their empire stretched beyond banking into publishing, mining, and insurance, with operations spanning London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. Their influence reached from royal courts to factory floors, and wherever money moved, the Rothschilds were never far behind. One of the clearest examples of their political and financial reach came during the Crimean War of the 1850s, a brutal conflict pitting Russia against a coalition of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. For centuries, Russia and the Turks had fought over the Black Sea and the Balkans, but by mid-century, the stakes were higher than ever. European powers feared that a victorious Russia might swallow the Ottoman territories and dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Britain and France joined the fight, launching costly military campaigns on the Crimean Peninsula. War meant money, and vast sums were needed to fund it. The Rothschilds stepped forward, providing loans to the British government, but this time their motivation was not purely financial. Russia had begun enforcing harsh anti-Jewish laws, creating the Pale of Settlement, a region stretching from modern Latvia to Ukraine, where Jews were confined and excluded from most professions. For Lionel Rothschild, who managed the London branch, this was personal. His loan to the British government was driven partly by conviction, a stand against Russian oppression. It was an investment made as much from principle as from profit. The British never fully repaid him, yet Lionel's gesture demonstrated something rare in 19th century finance, a belief that even immense wealth carried moral weight. The Crimean War ended in an uneasy stalemate, but Britain and France had succeeded in halting Russia's advance. For the Rothschilds, their loans during the war were less a business decision than an act of conscience, a form of philanthropy disguised as finance. They had opposed Russia's rising tide of anti-Semitism, which in the years ahead would drive hundreds of thousands of Jewish families to flee westward from the Pale of Settlement. Their wealth, in this case, became a tool of quiet resistance.
It was not the only time the Rothschilds used their fortune for compassion. In the 1840s, a strange new fungus arrived in Europe aboard steamships from America. The voyage was short enough for the blight to survive, and soon it ravaged the continent's potato crops. In Ireland and Poland, where the potato had become the poor man's lifeline, disaster struck. In Ireland alone, more than 1 million people perished. while others fled overseas in desperate search of survival. The British government's response was slow and cold, continuing to export food even as its own citizens starved. Amid this tragedy, the Rothschilds financed the British Relief Association, which distributed aid between 1846 and 1848, the darkest years of the famine. Their intervention saved countless lives and remains one of the few bright spots in that grim chapter of history. When the Blight later struck Scotland, it deepened the suffering already caused by the Highland clearances, a forced displacement that had left thousands destitute. Once again, Lionel de Rothschild stepped forward. He funded the Highland and Island Emigration Society, helping impoverished Scots from the remote Highlands and Outer Hebrides to resettle in the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. For many, it was a one-way journey from despair to hope, made possible by Rothschild philanthropy.
Throughout the 19th century, the family's generosity continued. Libraries, hospitals, scholarships, and social programs all bore their quiet mark. Yet, like all great dynasties, the Rothschilds also produced their share of unusual personalities. Among them, none stood out more than Walter Rothschild, the eccentric heir of the London branch. Born in 1868, Walter lived a life that seemed ordinary at first glance. He worked within the family's London banking firm, served as a Member of Parliament for Aylesbury between 1899 and 1910, and held a commission in the Army Reserves. Later, he would become a key intermediary between the British government and the emerging movement for a Jewish homeland in the Middle East after the First World War. But his true passion and his greatest peculiarity lay far from the boardroom or parliament. Walter Rothschild was obsessed with animals. Walter Rothschild's fascination with the natural world began during his student years at Cambridge. While most young men of his class focused on politics or business, Walter immersed himself in zoology. Throughout his life, he poured vast sums of his inheritance into collecting animals, both living and preserved. By the time he died, his private natural history collection numbered in the millions butterflies, birds, insects, mammals enough to fill entire museums. Many newly discovered species were even named in his honor. His eccentricity bordered on the theatrical. One famous photograph shows Walter astride a giant tortoise as if it were a horse. In another unforgettable stunt, he harnessed 4 zebras to a carriage and drove them through the streets of London all the way to Buckingham Palace to prove that African animals could be domesticated like horses. London society was amused, the newspapers had their story, and Walter became a legend of eccentric genius. Unsurprisingly, zebra-drawn carriages never became fashionable. The family's interests, however, were far broader than science. As their wealth multiplied, the Rothschilds diversified into new industries: railways, mining, publishing, and perhaps most famously, wine. In 1853, Nathaniel Rothschild purchased several vineyards in France, beginning a new chapter for the dynasty. By the late 1860s, other family members had followed, acquiring prestigious estates such as Château Mouton and Château Lafite in Bordeaux. Their timing, however, was spectacularly unlucky. Steamships that had carried the potato blight decades earlier also brought the phylloxera aphid, a pest that devastated Europe's vineyards. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, French wine production collapsed as the disease spread, destroying countless livelihoods. Yet the Rothschilds, sustained by immense resources, survived where others failed. By grafting French vines onto resistant American rootstocks in the 1880s, the industry recovered and the Rothschild estates emerged stronger than ever. Today, Château Lafite Rothschild remains one of the world's most iconic wines, a symbol of endurance and prestige. Throughout the 19th century, whenever European governments faced financial ruin, there was one name they called first: Rothschild. Long before the age of bailout funds and central banks, the family acted as lenders of last resort. When nations stumbled, their gold and credibility kept economies afloat. The Austrian Empire, for instance, found itself drowning in debt by the mid-1860s. Years of turmoil had drained Vienna's treasury. The revolutions of 1848 had nearly torn the empire apart. Hungary came close to winning independence, and putting down that rebellion cost a fortune. Then came further wars in northern Italy, and finally, the disastrous Austro-Prussian War. By the mid-decade, Austria's finances were collapsing, and its government was desperate for salvation. And once again, as had happened so many times before, Europe turned to the House of Rothschild. As Austria's economy buckled under war and debt, the Rothschilds once again stepped in. Through the 1860s, they extended vast loans worth millions of pounds to keep the government in Vienna solvent. Even after Austria's humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1866, the loans continued, propping up an empire on the verge of collapse. Eventually, the debt became unmanageable. With no other choice, the Austrian crown agreed to a political compromise, ending its military occupation of Hungary and forming a new dual monarchy in 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a transformation born as much from finance as from politics, and the Rothschilds stood at the heart of it. Their influence reached far beyond Vienna. Just a few years later, the Prussians defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, laying siege to Paris and leaving the city in ruins. In the aftermath, the Rothschilds became key financiers of France's reconstruction. They backed the new Republican government, funding efforts to rebuild Paris not only as a functioning capital, but as the glittering cultural heart of Europe. At the same time, the French branch of the family poured investments into France's rapidly expanding railway network, connecting Paris with the rest of the nation and fueling industrial revival. Yet their greatest venture of the late 19th century took them far from Europe to the mineral-rich plains of southern Africa. For decades, British settlers, Boer farmers, and powerful Zulu kingdoms had fought for dominance in the region. Then came the discovery that would change everything: vast deposits of diamonds and gold near Kimberley. The scramble for wealth began, and at its center stood Cecil Rhodes, and behind him, the Rothschilds.
Through their London and Paris branches, the Rothschilds invested enormous capital into what became the De Beers Mining Company, transforming it into a global powerhouse. By the late 1880s and into the 90s, De Beers controlled nearly the entire world diamond trade and a significant share of gold production. It financed the British Empire's southern ambitions and laid the foundations of what would later become the Union of South Africa. While Cecil Rhodes was the public face of imperial ambition, the Rothschilds were its financiers, the invisible architects who supplied the capital that made empire possible. From Vienna's palaces to Paris's boulevards, from the mines of Kimberley to the counting houses of London, their wealth and influence shaped the very framework of the modern world.
Traitors out! Jews out! Our nation! Our future!
As the 19th century advanced, the Rothschilds' Jewish identity placed them at the center of Europe's changing attitudes toward faith, race, and power. In an era when pseudo-scientific theories of racial hierarchy were gaining ground, anti-Semitism surged across the continent. Conspiracy myths flourished, claiming that Jewish financiers, especially the Rothschilds, secretly controlled the world's politics and banks. These falsehoods would endure for generations, poisoning public discourse and overshadowing the family's genuine achievements. In response, the Rothschilds increasingly used their wealth to support Jewish causes. From London to Paris to Vienna, they funded schools, hospitals, and community institutions aimed at improving Jewish life across Europe. Yet, as anti-Semitism intensified, new ideas began to take hold among them. The dream of a return to the ancestral homeland in the Levant. The concept of Zionism, once theological, now became a political and practical goal. Alphonse de Rothschild, head of the French branch, became one of its earliest and most influential patrons. He and other family members quietly financed Jewish migration to Ottoman-controlled Palestine, purchasing tracts of land from local Arab owners and the Ottoman government alike. James Jacob de Rothschild helped establish one of the first modern Jewish settlements there, Rishon-LeZion, now part of Greater Tel Aviv. It became a model for later agricultural communities built by Zionist pioneers. Although most of the family remained in Europe, their contributions laid the groundwork for future generations. Through the Jewish Colonization Association and private endowments, the Rothschilds helped create the physical and financial foundations for what would one day become the State of Israel. Decades later, after the Second World War, Rothschild funding would even support the construction of Israel's Knesset and Supreme Court buildings, lasting symbols of the nation their ancestors had only dreamed of. The family's golden age stretched from Mayer Amschel's leadership in the late 18th century through the dominance of his sons and grandsons in the 19th. Yet the close of that century brought new challenges. The French branch, in particular, was hit hard during the global Long Depression between 1873 and 79. Ambitious investments in oil through the Caspian and Black Sea Petroleum Company initially prospered, but soon faltered under fierce competition from John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire. Financial turbulence compounded their difficulties. Stock market crashes in the 1880s dealt further blows, while anti-Semitic attacks intensified, painting the Rothschilds as symbols of global manipulation. Ironically, one disaster they wisely avoided was the ill-fated French attempt to dig a canal across Panama, a venture plagued by corruption, disease, and bankruptcy. Even so, their caution didn't spare them from public hostility. In France, anti-Semitic sentiment reached fever pitch during the infamous Dreyfus Affair between 1894 and 1906, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of spying for Germany. The case split the nation. The Rothschilds, as the most visible Jewish family in France, became lightning rods for hate. For all their philanthropy and service to nations across Europe, they found themselves again confronting the oldest prejudice of all, a stark reminder that wealth could build empires, but not always acceptance. The years between the wars brought both renewal and ruin. Europe emerged from the First World War scarred and exhausted, its empires dissolved and its borders redrawn. Northeastern France and Belgium lay in ashes, and revolutions flared across the continent as monarchies collapsed. Amid the chaos, the Rothschilds once again became indispensable, extending credit to the fragile new nations of Central Europe, Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Their loans kept governments functioning and currencies alive, though the Czechoslovak branch of the bank would soon be seized and nationalized by the new regime in Prague. The mid-1920s brought a brief surge of prosperity. Reconstruction turned into a boom, industry revived, and optimism returned until the crash came. When Wall Street collapsed in 1929, the shockwaves rippled across the Atlantic. The Great Depression struck Europe with brutal force, and one of its first casualties was a bank deeply tied to the Rothschild legacy, Credit Anstalt of Vienna. Founded in the mid-19th century by Anselm Salomon von Rothschild, Credit Anstalt had grown into Austria's financial titan. But by 1931, it had overstretched itself, swallowing smaller institutions during the boom years. When the bank admitted it could not publish its previous year's accounts, panic erupted. Depositors rushed to withdraw funds, and the entire Austrian financial system teetered on collapse. Desperate to stabilize the situation, members of the Rothschild family scrambled to raise emergency credit, but it was not enough. Creditanstalt was dismantled and partially nationalized, its fall sending shock through the markets of Europe. The collapse deepened the global depression and, tragically, fed into a growing tide of anti-Semitism. Extremist movements seized upon the Rothschild name as proof of their imagined conspiracies, twisting financial misfortune into racial hatred. As fascism gained strength, these poisonous myths became political weapons. In Germany, the Nazis built entire propaganda campaigns around the notion of Jewish control over global finance. By the time they seized power in 1933, the Rothschilds were portrayed as the shadowy villains of every economic woe. In 1940, the regime even released a film titled Die Rothschilds, distorting earlier portrayals of the family into venomous anti-Jewish propaganda.
Escalating tensions as inflammatory accusations.
The war years were devastating. While some family members found safety in Britain, others faced direct persecution as the Nazi Empire expanded across Europe. In March of 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, the Vienna branch of the Rothschild Bank was seized, its assets confiscated by the state. Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, head of the Austrian operations, was arrested and imprisoned. What had once been Europe's most powerful banking dynasty now found itself dismantled by the very forces it had long helped to finance and rebuild.
Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild was placed under house arrest after Austria's annexation. He endured months of confinement, but ultimately survived the war. Most of the Austrian branch had already escaped into Switzerland, narrowly avoiding capture. Their vast estates, art collections, and financial holdings were seized by the Nazi state. Decades later, even into the late 1990s, the family was still fighting to recover artworks once belonging to Louis Nathaniel's famed collection, masterpieces scattered and stolen during the occupation.
When the Second World War ended, the Rothschilds began the long process of rebuilding. Their empire, though battered, was not broken, yet the world had changed. The new global order was now dominated by the United States, while Europe's financial supremacy waned. The Rothschilds no longer held the unrivaled position they once enjoyed across the 19th century, but their adaptability kept them alive where so many dynasties faded.
In the decades that followed, the family's influence evolved rather than vanished. Some businesses merged, others transformed. In France, however, change came harshly. In 1981, the socialist government under François Mitterrand nationalized Rothschild Frères, effectively seizing one of the family's most historic institutions. Yet the setback was balanced by consolidation elsewhere, as the French and British branches strengthened ties and restructured their global operations. Diversification became their new strength. The family's earlier investment in the French wine industry, once seen as a gamble, blossomed spectacularly in the post-war world. Wine drinking expanded far beyond the Mediterranean, turning estates such as Château Lafite Rothschild into international icons. Today, that single vineyard alone is estimated to be worth billions of euros, a symbol of both luxury and longevity.
Much of the dynasty's wealth is now managed through trusts and holding companies tied to ventures founded in the 19th century. Rothschild & Co., headquartered jointly in London and Paris, oversees tens of billions in assets and manages hundreds of billions more for global clients. The family's name endures not as a symbol of monarchy or empire, but as a mark of resilience and quiet continuity.
To speak of the Rothschilds in the late 19th century was to invoke the heartbeat of the British Empire, a family whose reach spanned continents and whose fortune helped shape modern capitalism itself. Today their influence is subtler but still profound. From banking to philanthropy, from fine wine to financial strategy, the Rothschilds remain what they have always been, the enduring architects of global finance, woven through the very fabric of modern history.
In the 19th century, everyone knew the name Rothschild. It stood for power, wealth, and influence, the invisible engine of Europe's economy. But a century and more later, that name no longer carries the same weight. In the 21st century, the Rothschilds are rarely spoken of in the same breath as Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, or Bernard Arnault. When Jacob Rothschild, the fourth Baron Rothschild, passed away in February 2024, the world noted his death with respect, but not with awe. The age when the family sat at the very center of global finance had long passed. Yet, the perception that the Rothschilds have vanished from relevance isn't entirely true. They are not gone merely quieter. Like the Vanderbilt dynasty in America, their immense fortune was dispersed over generations, diluted but never destroyed. There is no single Rothschild today who commands the concentrated power of a 19th century patriarch, but collectively, the family still holds vast wealth through their interconnected holdings. Their investments span industries mining, energy, banking, and beyond. Through companies like De Beers, Rio Tinto, and countless others, the Rothschild legacy continues to shape markets from the shadows. Estimates of their total fortune vary wildly. Some claim the dynasty controls trillions, though such figures belong more to myth than fact. Realistically, their combined assets still amount to hundreds of billions, a fortune that ensures the Rothschild name remains one of quiet endurance rather than extinction.
Whether admired or misunderstood, the Rothschilds occupy a singular place in modern history. Few families have influenced so much banking, politics, philanthropy, art, and the very architecture of capitalism itself. Even those who know little of their exact deeds still recognize the name as a symbol of financial genius and controversy intertwined. And so, the story comes full circle. It began in the narrow streets of Frankfurt, where Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a modest moneylender, built the foundation of an empire. Through wars, revolutions, and centuries of change, his descendants turned fortune into legend. They financed kings and nations, backed revolutions and empires, and in doing so, reshaped the modern world. Their legacy is not just one of wealth, but of vision, a reminder that behind every era of power stands the unseen hand of those who understood money better than anyone else. In the decades that followed Europe's great wars, the Rothschilds continued to expand their reach, becoming one of the chief sources of capital for nations rebuilding and empires rising. It was a defining moment in human history, the height of imperial ambition, the dawn of globalization, and the birth of the Second Industrial Revolution. Railways, telegraphs, steamships, and factories reshaped the planet. And behind much of this transformation flowed Rothschild money. Their banks fueled progress, underwriting the expansion of industry and empire alike. Yet for all their power, the Rothschilds never viewed wealth as an end in itself. Like many great dynasties of the 19th century, they believed prosperity carried moral duty. They gave generously to hospitals, schools, and communities. They funded relief efforts for the poor and displaced from the starving families of Ireland during the Great Famine to the Highlanders forced from their lands in Scotland. They worked quietly to protect Jewish communities across Europe from persecution and poverty, using influence as both shield and sanctuary.
Today, the family still exists, though their presence is far less visible. The modern Rothschilds no longer command empires, but their legacy remains etched into the foundations of global finance and philanthropy. To understand how the modern world of banking, trade, and industry took shape is, in many ways, to trace the story of the Rothschilds themselves, a family whose vision and fortune helped shape an age. So, what do you think of the Rothschilds? Were they the most dynamic and visionary bankers the world has ever known, or simply the luckiest, their rise driven by the fortunes of war and history's accidents? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Whatever the case, their legacy endures not just in balance sheets or family names, but in the very structure of the world they helped to build.